Welcome to the Storycraft Cafe. Come in, grab a cup of your favorite beverage, and get ready to join the storytelling conversation. Storycraft Cafe is brought to you by Dabble, the ultimate cloud-based fiction writing software. Here we're going to bring together storytellers from all walks to encourage and empower you to craft your best story. What is the hallmark of most successful people? They practice at their craft. Today, Joe Bunting from The Right Practice joins us for a wide-ranging conversation about writing, publishing, following your dreams, getting better at the thing that you love. This is such a fantastic conversation. I know you're going to love it. Thanks, as always, to Dabble for making this podcast possible. Also, storycraft.cafe is a place where you can connect with other writers and stay abreast of all of these live events that we're constantly doing. Storycraft.cafe, dabblewriter.com. Now on to our show with Joe. And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Today, I am super excited to have Joe Bunting with me. He is an author and the founder of The Right Practice. And because we have had we've had some challenges getting this particular show off the ground. Joe had some illness that he was dealing with a couple weeks ago, and then yesterday my internet just died, and then I walked outside and there's a guy from the cable company rolling out a spool of cable, and something happened and they had to string all new cable. It was terrible. But anyway, Joe was gracious and we were able to do it today. But that only tells me that because we had so much difficulty getting to this point, it's going to be an amazing chat, and it is going to be well worth waiting for. Joe, I'm so glad to have you on the show with us today. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks so much, Hank. I'm a huge fan of the show, and I do think it's the principle of balance, right? The universe just knew that this was going to be such a life-changing conversation that it had to put some brakes on it.
Absolutely. I believe that wholeheartedly. Joe, I like to start conversations off with a fun question and to kind of get to know you a little better. And a question that I love to ask people is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, gosh, that's such a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my passion and interest in becoming a writer came in part because of my dad. So I actually, my dad, when I was about 10 years old, got really sick. He had a disease called chronic fatigue syndrome, which basically meant that he couldn't work. He couldn't do much. He could kind of just like sit around the house and stare out the window, and he would play with me sometimes and then be in bed for a week, after that. So it was a really hard time in all of our lives, my whole family's life. But one of the weird things was that during that time, he could write. For whatever reason, his brain, he couldn't even read, but he could write. And so he would get up every day and write for a couple of hours and then collapse back in bed. And doing this over a couple of years, he wrote a really ginormous fantasy book. And I think it was the first time realizing that, books, these things that I really enjoy reading and get immersed in, and by that point have become passionate about, they actually come from somewhere. Like,
right.
There are people who create them. And, it was a couple of years later where I thought, while reading a book, maybe I could do that. Maybe I could create a book like my favorite authors. And I just had this image of like sitting around hanging out with characters that I loved and just enjoying it. Of course, that's not what being a writer actually looks like most of the time. but it sounded really idyllic to me. And I think that's where it all began, right?
I love it. Were you a fan of fantasy? Since your dad wrote a fantasy book, was that a shared passion in your family?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think I've always been interested in all different kinds of stories. Yeah. I would read like really literary stories and the classics, and then I would, binge fantasy and science fiction and everything in between. So I read a huge variety of things, which is fun.
Yeah. When, as you grew up, you saw your dad go through this process. What did you see as your career path? Because if I've learned anything from all these author interviews that we've done, is that the path to becoming an author is usually a circuitous path. It's, you go over here and collect these life experiences, and you go over here and collect these life experiences, and you have relationships with these people, and all of that, it just adds things to the writer toolbox. What did you see from an early age? What did you see as your life path?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think I remember touring a university as I was thinking about going to college, and I was wanting to study creative writing. And my dad's like, by this time he was better, fortunately, but my dad was like, I want him to get a job and be successful and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, Dad, I'm going to be an author. I'm going to make so much money as like a New York Times bestselling author, obviously. And I just had this image of writing my first book. And of course it was going to be a huge success. At 17 years old, as you have like this ridiculous amount of confidence, but very little competence, right? Which that, of course, has not been my career path, but I've had some successes and some failures. And it's been as you said, very circuitous, but amazing journey. Yeah. And certainly meaningful.
You, according to your bio, you have written you have ghostwritten a number of projects, and then you had this really fascinating kind of crowdsourced, but the crowdsourcing became a topic of the book, kind of very meta. How did that come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I wanted to do the author thing, right? In my early 20s, I had this like huge urge to travel the world and write and be internet famous and all of those things. And, that sort of circuitously led to me starting the Write Practice, where we teach creative writing. But I had this dream of living in other countries and writing, right? And the opportunity, amazingly, unpredictably came where I could like quit my job, and my wife could quit her job, and we could go travel, and I could work remotely. And wow. But we instead of going to like a very inexpensive country to live, we of course chose to go where my wife wanted to go, which was France, and specifically Paris. And everything was like twice as expensive as I wanted it to be. Right. And so we had some money, and we needed a little bit more, like $3,000 or something. And so I put it out there in the world. If you help fund this adventure, I will take your suggestions and turn it into a book. And we had hundreds of people send in suggestions, and I did them in Paris. We were there with my wife, of course, and my 10-month-old son. And it was an amazing experience. I did some very uncomfortable things, like eat tripe. the stomach lining of a cow, which is, some people love. It was okay, but it was definitely not what I would have chosen. And explore the catacombs in Paris, both the legal ones and the illegal ones, which was very exciting, and do some street performing. There was a whole lot of things that as an introvert writer were very uncomfortable to me, but I had to do because my audience was waiting for it. And it was really fun. It was a cool experience. And, that became the book.
As someone who's been married for almost 30 years, I have to ask, what was your wife's reaction to when you said, okay, I've got this great idea of how we can make the trip happen, but we're going to take suggestions from strangers and do it on our trip?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was one of those things where she was very initially anti, right? She said, oh, we can't do that. We can't leave our jobs. We can't travel for many months with our 10-month-old, blah, 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 blah. And, then I thought, okay, if it's Paris, she'll have to go because Paris. And so I floated that idea, and she's still like, no, it's a crazy idea, And then I think it was just like later that night, we were at a party, and I overheard her talking to our friends about how we were going to go to Paris, and I was going to write this book, and we were going to travel and that's, I guess, just how it happened, right? We're initially very anti, and then she kind of, it was her idea by the end of the day, right?
I love it. The Right Practice is not only a website that has great instructional content, but is a community as well. Where did you said that you had already started the Right Practice when that came along? What was the initial idea for the Right Practice, and kind of what instigated what got the ball rolling?
Yeah, I think that the initial idea came even before I started thinking about teaching writing, when I was finishing my first book. So I had studied creative writing in college, thinking that this is what's going to make me an author, that's going to accomplish all my dreams, right? I thought like a degree is going to do it for me. And surprisingly, universities are not great at teaching people how to become New York Times bestselling authors and make a living as a creative writer. It was very upsetting to me to learn that. So I graduated college and kind of floundered. I did a little bit of journalism, and that went okay, and did some travel writing and blogging, and I ended up like stumbling into a co-writing, ghostwriting job with a mentor of mine, and he had written a book before and was coaching me, and had also hired a friend of mine from college who had written a New York Times bestselling book, who was coaching me. And they just gave me this process, right, to plan out the book. I didn't know how to do that at the time. And follow, the plan and write every week and hit my deadlines and finish a book and then edit the book. And it was one of the hardest, most stressful, most amazing times in my life. I had wanted to do this thing. I had tried and failed so many times. I mean, probably more than a dozen times I tried to write a book and it didn't work. And then the first time I did it with a coach, it worked. And I finished that book. It was published. It was this really amazing learning experience. And afterward, I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to grow as a writer. I knew I wanted to do more of this, but I wasn't quite sure how. And I also knew that I still had so much more to learn, right? I mean, I think anytime when you're first getting started, you think you kind of know it all, right? And then you slowly realize how little you know over the process. And I had reached that point where I realized, oh my gosh, I have so much more to learn. And I knew one of the best ways to learn was to teach, right? And so I wanted to teach, and I wanted to stay in that world of creative writing and grow in that. And so I stumbled on this idea to start a website called The Right Practice, where we taught creative writing, where we helped people practice creative writing, because I realized that in college I had learned a lot of theory, but I hadn't been doing actual practice, and I wanted to, bring this idea of deliberate practice into teaching creative writing. And we started in 2011. 6 months later, we won an award for top 10 blogs for creative writers. We quickly, grew from there, and now it's one of the top writing websites in the world, and we reach millions of people every year. So it's been a really amazing experience. And just, I think so many people are struggling to write books. So many people are struggling to make their creative dreams come true, right? Just as I was. And it's been amazing to get to step alongside people in that place, to equip them with some tools and some theory and some way of thinking about writing, and then really celebrate them as they start to experience some success.
Yeah. I think, Joe, if you took, say a group of 100 people and you put them in a room and you polled this group of 100 people and you asked them, who of you thinks that there's a story inside of you, the potential for a book, or, just a story to tell? I think the vast majority, if not all of them, would raise their hands. I think it's an innate thing in most people, if not all, that we have something in us that we want to share. We're a storytelling species, if you will. And if you look back through our history of oral storytelling to then writing down our histories and our, way of life and our wisdom to pass down, I mean, we're a storytelling people. But then if you then poll that same 100, group of 100 people, how many of you in the next year will take the first step to do that? Then, that dwindles down. And then, how many of you will actually write the book? And then it dwindles down again. And then, how many of you will publish that work? You might have one, person left in that group. Do you, and I think those things are generally true, we're just speculating here, but, of that group of people that never do it, do you think they are more divided? I see them as kind of dividing into two camps. Either they don't understand the mechanics of writing. They don't understand story structure and how to get from point A to point B and all of the ups and downs that are in the middle. That's kind of, I classify that as the mechanics of writing. We don't understand story structure, how to tell a story. But the other camp of people are people that either do understand the mechanics or can figure it out. They've read novels before. They understand kind of the path of what a book is like, but they lack motivation, or they lack organization skills, or whatever it is. They understand it, but they just can't put it into practice. Where do you fall there? Do you think that people come to you for one or the other of those problems, a mixture, or where do you think most people lie?
Such a good question. And I do think that there are people who struggle with discipline and deadlines, and people who struggle with not knowing how to do something, right?
Yeah.
And I think, for both of those camps, the solution is practice, right? Deliberate practice specifically, which is what, our whole thing that we talk about at The Right Practice is about. It's kind of how we live and teach writing. We really believe that everyone can become great writers, can become successful writers through deliberate practice. All 100 of those people, and we have a lot of different ways to help people through that, right? So, for the people who struggle with learning how to write, and the mechanics of that, I think the best way to learn is by doing it, right? So there's that great story that maybe people have already heard before of the pottery teacher. That story, right? Where there were two, the pottery teacher had a class and there's like two groups of people. He split the class up into two groups of people. And to one side of the class, he said, okay, you'll get an A if you create the perfect pot. And to the other side of the class, he said, you'll get an A if you create the heaviest amount of pots, like the most amount of pots by weight, right? If you have like 50 pots, or 50 pounds of pots, you'll get an A. And by the end of the class, the people who got the A were not the people who created the perfect pots, right? They were not the side that had to create one perfect pot. It was the side that had to create a lot of pots. And so there's something about iteration and having to do things again and again in repetition. And this is such an important piece of deliberate practice. We have so many people in our community who write a really bad first book and then a kind of bad second book and even third book. I have this one friend in our community who she had one book that she wrote and she had an editor and the editor told her, hey, actually, this is 3 books. This isn't just one book. This is 3. And so she did it. She rewrote that book into 3 books and they were pretty okay. Like they weren't amazing, but they got done. And then she started this 4th book and she originally just thought it was a book of short stories. And we were reading it and just like laughing so much and enjoying the characters. And it was so well written and just realizing, oh my gosh, like this is really, really good. And if you compare it to her first book, it's like amazing, and that's how it goes. I think if you talk to New York Times bestselling authors that, right, they have this same experience where the first couple of books they write, like, yeah, haven't helped them. Like those things are in desk drawers, basements. No one's reading those, but their 3rd or 4th book, they're starting to get it. And by the 5th or 6th or 7th book, it's a new kind of thing, right?
Well, it's why we have the term desk drawer novel or trunk novel, as they used to be called, that everyone has this novel that they finished and it's going in the desk drawer or going in a trunk in their bedroom, not to ever be seen by anyone, but
right.
It's kind of a rite of passage.
And so that brings us back to the other half of the people, right, who struggle with discipline, because how do you keep going, right, if you know that the book that you're writing right now is going to suck, which is actually something even New York Times bestselling authors deal with a lot of times on the first draft. They just have more patience and they realize this is part of the process, but first drafts just suck. Right. Yeah. And they're hard and they are messy and painful. And, I'm talking with a friend who's working on a novel right now and he is going nuts. He is like writing 5,000 words a day and he's, in 2 weeks on 43,000 words. And he's like, I'm getting a little bit slower. It's not as easy. And I'm like, yeah, that's how it goes. The first 10,000 or 20,000 words, or for him, 40,000 words are easy. And then it gets harder and harder and harder. And around like 50% through your book, like it gets really hard. And that for, we've seen doesn't really clear up until about 80%, And so how do you finish from right around when it gets hard, somewhere in between like 20 to 50% of the way through your book, to 80% when it gets easy again, right? And fun. How do you stay going? And what we found is, there's a lot of tricks. And writers, assemble this bag of tricks throughout their career. And most of them have some kind of coach, right, who can help guide them along the path. And for a lot of writers, they luck into having that kind of coach or mentor, or they hire someone, or they have an editor, or, someone who has been through the process and knows and can guide them through it. That's been true for my experience and so many authors in our community.
Yeah. That concept of the desk drawer novel or the trunk novel is so ubiquitous in the writing community. But there is a small faction of writers, and I've learned this through interviews over the years, that the vast majority, 80% or better, have a desk drawer novel. That novel that they wrote, they finished, wasn't good enough. They started a new project altogether. But there's a small minority of writers who don't do that. They take this book that they wrote that was not good enough, and they go through the editing process until it is good enough. Where do you think that the mindset difference between this one is not good enough, I'm going to write a completely different book and keep working on my deficiencies as a writer until I work them out, or find a better premise, or whatever the magic is that makes this one work, as opposed to the original one, versus the people that say, this book is not good enough, I'm going to stay in this story, I'm going to stay in this world until it is good enough. And do you have advice for people to abandon this one and go to something new, or keep working on that? I guess I'm struggling with understanding what the mindset difference is between moving on to something completely new or sticking it out until this thing is good enough.
And maybe just an appetite for suffering.
Maybe.
I mean, I think I identify with those people who just need to revise and revise and revise. I would say that I'm kind of like that, especially with the books that I really care about that are mine. It took me 5 years to finish Crowdsourcing Paris. I'm working on a novel right now, and I'm like 3 years in 3 drafts, right? And there is something about like suffering that is just both horrible and kind of attractive, like that you're going to slave away on this book until it's perfect, and that's okay. So I don't know. I mean, I think what I would say to those people is just keep doing drafts, right? And don't get stuck thinking about your book. Take action on your book, right? As writers, we are dreamers, and that's a really good thing. But dreams are only good if you want to be a writer, if you are writing, right? You have to be taking action on them to make them a reality. And, I tell writers in our community a lot, writers write for others. If you are just writing for yourself, that's fine, but that's journaling, right? And we can grow as writers. There's a lot of benefit to that. Not everyone in the world has to be a writer, but if you want to be a writer, you need to be sharing your writing with the world, whatever the way that looks, whether that's traditional publishing or self-publishing or just giving it to friends and family. There's something about that, the craft and aspect of writing, that needs to be shared. Just going back to your original point about like people as humans telling stories around campfires, right? That's something innate in humanity and into this craft that we're called to, right? And so, I would set some deadlines for when you are going to share your writing with the world. All right. We are big believers in the right practice about deadlines, and not just deadlines for when you're going to finish the next draft, but set a deadline for when you're going to share it. Okay. And it doesn't, again, need to be complicated. It doesn't have to be you're going to upload it to Amazon. It could be just you're going to print it out and give it to 12 friends and say, what do you think? Right. But set a deadline for sharing and then create some consequences. Okay. So one of the things about humans is that we are really driven by loss aversion. Okay. We like rewards. Rewards are great. It's great to incentivize yourself to finish, like give yourself a reward to finish your book or a day's writing session or something like that. But there's something about consequences and loss aversion that is just like lights up our brains. Right. Yeah. And so the way that we do that, the way I discovered it was I had a friend who I was in the middle of writing my memoir, Crowdsourcing Paris, and I was really struggling. I was like not taking action, not working on it, thinking a lot about it, but not doing it. Right. Mm. And he said, if you really want to finish your book, here's what you need to do. You need to write a check for $1,000 to the charity that you hate the most, like the Society for the Euthanasia of Puppies or something. Okay. And you need to give it to a friend and say, hey, if I don't finish my book in 10 weeks or however long, you have to send this check. And I'm like, that's stupid. I'm a professional writer. Like at the time I had written several books. I was earning a full-time living off my writing. And I'm like, I've got this. I'm a pro. But then a couple weeks went by and I hadn't done anything still. And someone asked me, what are you doing about that book? And I'm like, oh gosh, I have to do the thing. So I wrote a check for $1,000. And this was in 2016 during the presidential election. And I wrote it to the presidential candidate that I most disliked. And I gave it to a friend. And I said, you have to send this if I don't finish my book. And I will tell you, like, I was the most focused I've ever been. I finished that book in 9 weeks. It was amazing, right? And I realized, all the times that I had finished books before that, I had done the same thing. I had a deadline. I had consequences. I needed those things to stay focused. And so for me, that was a really useful tool. And I think that can be very useful to anyone. I read the same idea in Atomic Habits 10 years later. It's a really good trick that you can use. So that's what I would say is like, if you are that person who is revising and revising and revising, or if you're that person who is struggling to get started, right? Set a deadline, whether that's to finish your first draft or to share your draft with the world, and then put some consequences behind it. Right. And it's good to set small deadlines, like a weekly deadline. Mm-hmm. So you can just break it up into smaller pieces for, 5,000 words per week, for example. And maybe make some little consequences with that so you're not going to play your favorite phone game or you're going to uninstall the Instagram app off your phone or whatever. Right. Just some like guilty pleasure kind of consequences. And then a big consequence for if I don't finish my book after 10 weeks or however long, right. Or if I don't publish my book in some way, a big consequence.
If someone, and I love everything that you said, and consequences are something that I've not thought a lot about. As someone who has raised children, we have 5 children, and I know you have kids as well. There are a lot of things you can do to train a child that if you do this right, you will get a reward that works. a lot of times, and it works with a lot of kids, but there's always that one kid in the bunch that reward is not their greatest motivator. It's the threat of trouble. Is a much greater motivator, and that's probably another discussion for another forum. But I do love that that's part of your process, because so many of us will do things to avoid that discomfort far more than we will to get the chocolate chip cookie at the end of it. Was there something behind that discovery that you realized? Was it the 2016 election that kind of brought that about, or how did that epiphany come to you?
Yeah. And one thing I'll say too is that consequences and deadlines are not enough. Like, the work itself has to be rewarding. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, as writers, we write because we love writing, and we love the craft, and we love, reading, we love books and the aspect of creating new things and bringing the things that are in our heads out into the world. Like, that's a really pleasurable, amazing, rewarding experience. But also, like, writing is work. It's hard and annoying and embarrassing. Like, I've had some of my lowest confidence, lowest like mental health days working on books, so what do you do when it's a struggle? And you need these kinds of tricks, just like our kids need some tricks to get motivated and get moving. It's amazing when they discover something that they can just do, or that they've done so many times that it's just easy for them. Right. And so we use these tricks to get us into the work, so that the work itself can be useful, right? So that it can happen. But for me, I'm just like the most all over the place person, like the least structured person. I really struggle with all of the things, like deadlines. I missed in school every deadline possible. Homework was a disaster for me. I was the kid that thumbed my nose at both the consequences my parents gave me and the rewards, right? So, I had to really work to make my dreams of becoming a writer happen. And mostly failed for a decade. Despite investing a lot of money and my parents' money and my money into a creative writing degree and, journalism and all of the things afterward. And so, it wasn't really until I had a coach who could step alongside me and kind of do the work with me. They weren't doing the work, but having someone there with you kind of changes things.
It does.
Like the parent that comes alongside the child and does the work with them and shows them how to do it. And, I think we underestimate the social aspect of writing. I think if you look at the great writers throughout history, they had mentors, they had communities that they were part of. Hemingway, had Gertrude Stein and other mentors, the Lost Generation in Paris, Virginia Woolf had the Bloomsbury Group, and writers throughout history have had these communities who showed them the ropes.
Yeah. Well, for whatever reason, we have romanticized the idea of the introvert writer, the person that sits in a cabin alone at the top of the hill and, pounds out this manuscript and then throws it down the hill and it magically gets published or whatever, without them having to have any interpersonal, involvement or communication with anyone. And it's just not true. It's a writer with a lack of community. I suppose is probably not a very good writer.
No, I totally agree with that. I mean, without the friends who asked me, what happened to your book? or the coach who said, "Hey, how are you doing on those on that chapter deadline?"
Yeah.
I absolutely wouldn't have finished any of the books that I finished. Right. But now it's more than a dozen. And from like the least structured person, right? There's something about people that we learn from people. This is like how we are as humans. Like, and this is why we share stories. We are connected to other people. And so, that's why forums like this are so great, because we can learn from each other. We can learn from the authors that you're interviewing. And also it's great to have someone you can have a conversation with. And that's where like a coach or a mentor comes in. I think it's so important.
Yeah. So if someone is hearing our conversation and is wondering, what is this thing, the right practice? If they come to the right practice, what can they expect? And what are you offering what is it that you do that people can get involved with, and what's the path from there?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So, therightpractice.com, we've published more than 2,000 guides and articles on the writing process and different aspects of the writing process, from like grammar and punctuation to how to write a novel or a memoir or a book, and beyond that, right? So, we have a lot of resources just available to anyone, and you can go subscribe and sign up and get those resources on a weekly or even daily basis. We also have a program called 100-Day Book, which is a really cool way to have us do the deadline setting for you and some of the coaching for you. And you can sign up and you get a deadline, and you get weekly deadlines and really a structure to finish your book. I finished 3 drafts in 100-Day Book personally. I take it because I need that structure. I really suck at this and I need structure. And so we have, coaches who are part of that. And we just launched a new thing where we're training a group of book coaches, right, in our process around deliberate practice. So if anyone's interested in being a coach, we have that we're doing now. And then also connecting them with writers who need someone that they can just talk one-on-one with, who can read some of their writing, give them some feedback, but also just show them the way, right? We need those people who can kind of look over our shoulder and say, here's what you're struggling with. This is what's important for you to focus on right now. Right. This is the path you can take. And here's how you accomplish your goals.
So it seems to me that the right practice has a level of involvement that is sort of a choose your own adventure, if you will, for people that visit there. They can read the blogs, they can pick up lots of great advice and the how-to articles and the guides that have been published. But then if they want to take another step, there's a community that they can get involved with. And then there's another step where you can actually have a coach that helps you go through the process. The community. What is the community aspect of the right practice involve?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, writers can't be successful without community, right? And that's definitely been my experience. We need other writers around us who can encourage and support us and just spur us on. Right. It's like that saying, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Right. If you don't have other writers in your life who can inspire you and make you better, that's going to it's going to lower your average. Right. Yeah. So we need that aspect of community. And so we have a community workshop at The Right Practice where you can join and just connect with other writers who are doing the work, who are practicing, who are writing books and publishing them and learning the process, and everywhere in between that too. And you can get feedback on your writing as well. So I think an important part of deliberate practice is getting feedback. You need to see where your writing is working and where it's not working at all.
Yeah.
And also you need to be giving feedback so that you can kind of hone your own eye editorially and see, okay, I like that what this person is doing here, but I really don't like what they're doing here. And I don't want to do that in my own writing, and that's part of the learning process. So we have a workshop where you can share chapters of your work in progress, and get feedback and give feedback. It's a really cool thing. We have a lot of great conversations where we're sharing resources. And then, of course, our courses and 100-day book community is also there as well.
Gotcha. And then what does the coaching involve? If someone wants to take the next step and have, someone who can, turn a critical eye toward their, and I mean critical in the, not as to criticize, but
right, of course.
Yeah, to help where you're point out your problem areas or to coach along. What is that element of the right practice about?
Yeah, so we have a group of coaches that coach all different genres. So it starts where we connect you with a coach in our team, and then it really begins at the beginning with a plan, which is what my first coach taught me how to do, was create a plan. And then your coach looks at your plan with you and says, okay, here are the problems that you're going to run into, because it can be very obvious to a coach. Like, this is going to be really hard. This is going to be amazing. And I see what you're trying to do here. And let's just bring that out, and do more of that. And also, plan for solutions for those future problems. So really thinking through not just, an outline or a synopsis, but the whole writing process. One of the things that we found is that people in our community who have a plan are much more likely to finish their book. Okay. We did a study once where 52%, they were 52% more likely to finish if they had a plan, which is cool. Wow. Right. So just by creating a plan, you've already, done work to make sure
you're half as more likely to finish.
Exactly.
Statistically.
Yeah. So then, your coach looks at the plan, helps you through it, and sets deadlines with you. And they'll check in with you every week to see how you're doing on those deadlines. They'll hold you accountable, and then they'll have calls with you. They'll read some of your writing and have calls with you, usually once a month, sometimes more if you feel like you need that, where you're both kind of working through the aspects of writing that are hard, like where we get stuck, where we hit writer's block and perfectionism, and problem solving through those, and also giving you feedback, not from a mindset of revising right now, because when you're working on your first draft, if you spend too much time revising, you just get sucked back and you never finish. You just keep polishing those first couple of chapters. It's terrible. So you have to be going forward, and they'll kind of both teach you the process based on what they're seeing in your writing and give you feedback on how to do more of what you're doing well.
You mentioned earlier that you are actively looking for people that want to get involved in the coaching process. Over the 12 years or so that the right practice has been a thing, have you developed a right practice system of things that have over time been proven to work and things that can be replicated? I guess, is there have you had things that no matter who you are, what kind of book you're writing, what your problems are, these are things that we've identified as these will be problem areas. Here's how you go about fixing them. Yeah. Is there a scientific process to what you've determined?
I mean, we have. I don't want to be too bombastic about it, but I have coached communities of writing. Like, one of the reasons I started 100 Day Book is because I was coaching this group of writers on a gap year. They were in their early 20s and were interested in becoming writers, didn't really know what that looked like. And I was like their story coach, right? And I knew the best way to learn was through doing, right? And so we made it a goal that they would finish. It was about 10 weeks long program. They would finish a draft of a book in that 10 weeks. And if you've ever met 20 somethings, they can be very flaky. They can struggle to get things done. I was a 20 something not long before that. So I knew, right? Yeah. And so we created some consequences. And, basically, like, if they missed 3 weekly deadlines or they didn't finish their book, they were kicked out of the program. They had to leave. And so it was a big deal. It was a little scary for them, right? And every week, I would wait for the person I would have to have like a hard conversation with and say, okay, that's it. See ya. Right. And it never happened. It was amazing. 100% of those students finished their books. And we taught it like 3 or 4 times, and 100% finished. Right. So it is possible for everyone to do that. Of the 100 people in a room that you talked about, for 100 of them to do it. Right. But it takes some things. Right. So there's 5 different pieces of deliberate practice that we teach. The first part is theory. Okay. So it's just learning things about structure and writing and grammar and all of those things you learn in college. And we have our own system that we teach for story structure at the Right Practice called the Right Structure, which we probably don't have time to get into at all. But just learning the theory. But theory isn't enough. Like I learned after college and wasn't a New York Times bestselling author. You also have to put that theory to practice. You have to do the work. And that's where consequences and deadlines are helpful, where, just these different things, tricks that we use to help people stay focused. You also need to have a coach. Coaching is a really important aspect of deliberate practice across all disciplines, not just writing, but athletics, art, everything, right? You have to have a coach, someone who can show you the way. You have to have feedback, which we talked about, and you have to have a team. You have to have community who can support and encourage you. And so that's what we assemble for our coachees, our mentees, and for the writers in our community. We try to connect them as they're able and as they need with those 5 things, right? Theory, practice, coach, feedback, and a team. And if you do have those 5 things, you don't have to get it from us, but if you do have those 5 things, I think you'll be successful, right? It might not happen as quickly as you want, but if you keep focusing on those 5 things, you'll do it.
I think for a lot of new writers, there's this romantic idea of this book I have inside me, and it's going to come out, and it doesn't really matter what critics say or think because they don't understand my story. And the longer you practice at writing, the more and more that romanticism dispels. There is a structure that works. When you're dealing with genre fiction, there absolutely is a series of ups and downs and what's the word I'm looking for? Story beats, that happened at a certain point, and it seems formulaic, but it's what you do inside that formula that becomes magic. You talked about the process that you had, the right process to, the
right structure,
the right structure. Thank you. Could you touch on that for just a second?
Sure.
Like what is that, and what have you figured out, that is replicable, whatever the word is, over and over?
Yeah. I think it really goes back to the campfire analogy that we were talking about. As humans have been telling stories for thousands of years, right? We did not invent story structure. We did not invent storytelling. We've been doing this for a really long time. And as we've done that, there are these patterns that have emerged over thousands of years. And we can spot those patterns, and we can use those patterns. Cormac McCarthy, who is both somewhat genre, like he dips into genre, but also like one of the least formulaic writers.
The least. The man doesn't even like punctuation.
Right. And his stories have patterns. And he said, books, the unfortunate truth is that books are made from books, right? Stories are made from stories. We stand on the shoulders of giants, right? This is how we learn to tell stories, from the stories that have gone before us. And we can learn those patterns through reading thousands of books. And that's how people have traditionally done it, right? Just reading book after book after book. Or maybe right? You can study the patterns, right? So, Aristotle started pointing out some patterns. And then there was this Roman guy that I always forget the name of, and Gustav Freytag, the German novelist in the 1800s, Robert McKee. Like, there have been plenty of people who have talked about story structure and these patterns that are found in stories. And for us, we wanted to create a system that was just so stupid simple, right? Because we don't need to think about a lot of jargon. There's a lot of jargon around story theory, right? You've heard it like all, I'm sure, Hank.
Yeah.
And we just want to get past the jargon to like the simplest amount that you need to know to write your book, to get to work, to practice, right? And we can go deeper and deeper into this stuff. But at the end of the day, you just have to write your book, and we learn through doing, right? And so what are the simplest tools that you can use to write your book? I could talk for an hour. I could talk for 12 hours, and I have, about all this stuff because it's super fun. I think at the end of the day, just like recognizing that there are patterns and that there are people that have identified some of those patterns that you can use and then go get to work, right, quickly is important. And that's what we do in the right structure.
So a person that thinks they have a story in them, but is not quite sure where to begin, or a person that is deep in the novel and maybe thinks that, I need another set of eyes, someone who can, I'm too close to the work, a nonpartisan participant who can come in and help me. No matter if you're on this end of the process or this end of the process, the right practice has something to offer all of them. If someone comes to the right practice, where do they go from there?
Yeah, I think the best spot to go, there's a little orange button in the top right of our website that says join our community. And the URL is just therightpractice.com/join. And you'll see how we do things, all of the different ways to join in whatever you need and want to get involved at. And we'll get you connected with some really good resources, and hopefully we'll help you get to work.
Excellent. We'll put a link in the show notes to so folks can just click over and land there. Joe, this has been so much fun talking. I feel like we could talk for another 12 hours, but
next time
we'll definitely do this again. Thank you so much for joining me today. Therightpractice.com, is that the best URL for people to go to?
Yeah. And Hank, thanks so much for this work that you do. I know that you're a working writer, and it's not easy to both write and share with the world how to do this. So thanks for doing the hard work of both writing and also helping other writers. It's important, and you do a great job.
Well, thank you for that, Joe, and you as well. We're going to send everyone over to the Right Practice to come visit you. And again, let's do it again. That's our episode for today. There's so much more to come as we talk to authors about the craft of writing, but also the business of publishing. Be sure to subscribe to the Storycraft Cafe podcast in your favorite podcast app so that you never miss an episode. The Storycraft Cafe is made possible by Dabble. Writing a book is challenging. Your writing tool should not be. Dabble is an easy-to-use online writing tool packed with helpful features that allow beginning novelists and published authors to create amazing stories. Visit us at dabblewriter.com and start your free trial today. Thanks for listening.